Welcome to Living Web Farms. I'm glad you could make it tonight to our presentation on small engine maintenance and repair. Just a little bit about the farm and about our speaker. Chris Link is the Farm and Food Program Manager for Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy in Alexander, correct? Yeah. I've watched his presentations before. He's done a very good job in a number of presentations I've seen, so we invited him to speak tonight. Living Web Farms is a nonprofit research organization that does research and development in a variety of fields, agriculture, soil research, energy. We have our biochar facility, we have a livestock farm, we've got 3 different locations in the Mills River area, each sort of developing their own things, and we also have an educational facility on one of the smaller farms at Kimsey Road, where there's a school for younger people that are trained in trying to keep with hands-on, almost like a science and technology and biological approach to teaching with hands-on skills and some very qualified people. So it's a well-rounded, sustainable approach to education, both at the younger ages and adult education like we have here. So Chris is going to cover a lot of territory in here. And we can see we've got chainsaws, we've got a BCS walking tractor, we've got weed eaters. He'll be discussing 2-cycle and 4-cycle engines, maintenance, safety, talk a little bit about fuels, overwintering, storage, a lot of things. So without any further explanation, we'll just let Chris take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richard. My name is Chris Link. As Richard just mentioned, I'm with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. And this is going to be equipment management and maintenance. My background is landscape architecture, also farming and other hats over the years. But I started working on engines, different kinds of engines, since I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And I acquired my first seized up engine, a free moped. I freed the engine up and then proceeded to get many more after that, and finally an old car and restored that as my first car. So I've been working on engines since then and kind of ever since on different scales. And so when I started farming, obviously there are tools that you find on a homestead or at your house. Also you find those on the farm, and then there are also very farm-specific tools and equipment that I've learned about and worked on. I farmed in New England and in the Southeast. I have managed 7 tractors at any one time, the mechanic for 7 full-size tractors, and then also 2-wheel walk-behind tractors, and then small engines like in front of me, hand tools kind of thing, power tools. And so this is a lot of information. There's a lot that we could talk about this one little saw here for the whole time and not really learn everything that we need to know. So I'm going to walk a fine line between too much information and enough for you to walk away with something that you can go home and actually use and be able to troubleshoot, be able to understand what's going on with your piece of equipment so that you can actually have some idea what to do with it. So we're going to talk about a few things in here. We are going to be inside for a little while, not long, but I'm going to cover the different parts of an engine, what makes it run. We're going to cover troubleshooting, common problems, and then we're actually going to go outside and get around the BCS, do some maintenance to it, perform the required maintenance on it, which it needs, and then also pull a carburetor off one of these pieces of equipment, tear it down really quickly, rebuild it, and just see that process. It's pretty quick. It's not as scary as it may sound. I think anyone can do it. So we'll start there. So again, I just like to go ahead and say I'm with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. We have you can't read that, but we have a farmer incubator program. We train farmers. We have workshops. We have many different projects on site, stream restoration, reforestation projects, and a value-added kitchen. So we have a few different things going on there. I always like to mention we're at appalachian.org if anybody wants to learn more about those things. So first I'd like to start off with why learn this. Why would you want to know how to do these things? Obviously you're here, so you already know why. I'm not trying to answer that, but there are many different reasons. Obviously, you can save time and money, and a lot of the different reasons that you might want to work on your small equipment kind of come back to saving time and money, be it saving time by not having to go drive and find a new one, or order one and wait. So you have opportunity cost if your equipment's down and you're needing to do something with it that day. That's time, that's money. preventing landfill waste. So we kind of live in this more or less throwaway culture. If I went and bought a cheaper saw and it was 10 years old and something failed on it, I might call the company and they may say, we don't make that part anymore, sorry about it. And then you have an option there, and that is, I don't know, go on eBay, try and find one used or something, or say, hey, a new one only costs $100, let's just go get a new one. And that's completely reasonable and makes sense. But if you can keep things out of the landfill and you can learn how to work on it, it just means that you're a little more self-reliant on that piece of equipment. And then if you are using one piece of equipment, you may have all those parts that you need. So if something goes down in the moment, you go, oh, the bubble burst on this, I lost this cap, we have the extras in there, go grab it, replace it, and then we're ready to keep going. So it's nice to have the things you need to fix a specific piece of equipment. And obviously we're in a throwaway culture and more than just engines. It's everything from shoes to power equipment. And we need to know these basic things like farming, like housing, like clothing. To know these basic ways to fix things makes you a little more resilient and a little more empowered. So we're going to walk away today with some of that. Again, prevent more landfill waste, lower chances of equipment failure. So if you're maintaining your equipment and you know this equipment, you're going to maintain it and you're not just going to go, oh, I haven't touched it for a year or a couple years. It seems to be running still. And usually it just starts to go downhill. It won't hold idle. It won't accelerate. And you go, I don't know what to do. And you just throw it in the corner and you go do something else or get a hand tool out. So if you can keep that maintenance, which we'll talk about today, if you can keep that maintenance schedule going and know how to approach that maintenance, the equipment's going to run longer. And then bring awareness on how to use tools. So you can use a tool in a lot of different ways. And if you use it how it's meant to be used, it's going to last longer and it's going to require less maintenance. So those are all good reasons to learn this information. And then what are we going to cover today? So I kind of already mentioned it, but we're going to talk about engine basics, 2 and 4-stroke engines. Large engines are usually 4-stroke, smaller engines are usually 2-stroke, and there are reasons for that, but we're going to cover both. As Richard mentioned, I have a BCS tractor outside, it's a 2-wheel tractor, that's a 4-cycle engine, and then I have these smaller engines, which are 2-cycle, and we'll talk about both of those. Also, we'll cover diagnose and repair some most common problems. You go out and it won't start, what would you start to do? You would start to go through a process to figure out what may be wrong, and then you can start to work on it. Basic maintenance and the importance of the right fluids and settings. There are a lot of settings on some of these pieces of equipment, and knowing how they should be set means it's going to run better and it's going to perform the job better that you want it to do. And then fluids. We'll talk about fluids and what different pieces of equipment need and why they need that, and then the different options for all those fluids and what the fluids mean. And then the hands-on. So we'll maintenance repair 2-wheel tractor. We'll probably pull apart the weed eater engine some and look at that and perform a drain on the running gear for the BCS tractor, drain some engine oil, check the air filter, look over the spark plug, do all that kind of maintenance just to get an idea of what's required for that. Okay, so to jump in, the basics of an engine. So every engine has some basic needs that need to get met before it's going to run properly. Most folks probably already know this, but it's going to be your fire, air, and fuel. Fire is usually going to come from a spark plug. Your air is going to come from an intake, probably going through an air filter. That's also going through the carburetor. And then it needs fuel, and that's usually in the form of gasoline, through the carburetor. So we'll talk about carburetor. That's kind of the main sticking point for most engines is the carburetor. It's either dripping fuel, or it's just not running right, or you flood it when you're priming it, or whatever it might be. The carburetor usually has a lot to do with why the engine's not running. And so air and fuel are coming through that carb. So we're going to cover those. And then how engines work. So 4-cycle engines. So it completes one complete cycle in 4 strokes. That's why it's called a 4-stroke. 4 strokes to complete 1 cycle. 2 strokes obviously are going to be 2 strokes to complete 1 cycle. So with the 4-stroke, one key important piece is that oil is separate from the fuel and it's in the crankcase. As you probably know as well, when you put fuel in your car, it's a 4-stroke. When you put fuel in your car, you don't mix in oil as well. So it just takes straight gasoline, and there is oil in the crankcase down here. And then also, you have the basics of an engine here, which all engines have. Up top is a spark plug. Then just below, you have the piston and a connecting rod. And then you have an intake valve and then an exhaust valve. So what happens there in one of these 4-cycle engines is through the inlet valve, you're going to have air and fuel come into the cylinder, into the top of this cylinder. Air and fuel mixed together will ignite once it's given a spark. So the air and the fuel comes through the carburetor inside the cylinder head. The piston goes down, pushes down. The inlet valve closes up, locking all that air and fuel, and it's above the piston. The piston comes back up. When it comes to the top, the spark plug emits one little spark. One electrical pulse sends a spark to that plug. The plug has a little spark on the bottom inside that fuel and the air. Once it gets that spark, there's an explosion, right? The explosion forces that piston down again. The piston comes up and then it repeats. So that's 4 motions or four strokes to complete that one power cycle. So the power cycle is when the explosion happens and the piston is thrown down and it turns the crankshaft. That's the power stroke. So that happens with 4 movements in a 4-cycle engine. So again, both engines, 2-cycle and 4, are going to have a carburetor. They're going to have an intake, an inlet valve. They're going to have an exhaust valve. They're going to have a piston, connecting rod, crank, but they're going to be set up a little differently. So that's a 4-stroke engine. Any questions with that? 4 strokes, 1 cycle. So also, when you hear a 2-cycle engine, if you have a chainsaw running, it sounds, how would you say it? Or like a dirt bike. It sounds loud. And then if you heard a 4-stroke, like a lawnmower running, it's loud, but it's a little less intense. So that's just because you're getting way more strokes on a 2-cycle engine versus the 4. So 2-cycle engines. Again, complete cycle and 2 strokes of the piston. So this is the difference. Oil is mixed with gas through the injection or by premix. So some engines, like these, a 2-stroke engine in this chainsaw, you're going to mix the fuel and the oil and put it into the little tank here. On some pieces of equipment, you might have a separate reservoir that holds the oil and it mixes it for you. So in that application, you put straight gasoline into that machine, whatever it is. It could be a jet ski, even some motorcycles, 2-stroke motorcycles have that. And it's a separate reservoir and the piece of equipment does it for you. I'm going to say that most equipment that any of you are going to be using is going to need to be mixed. So it's not going to have a separate reservoir. And no small engine is going to have a separate reservoir for the engine oil. So you're always going to use a pre-mixed, whether you mix it or not. And there are a bunch of different ways to do that. I'm going to mix some gas. I have straight gasoline down there in the gas can, and then I have the engine oil that gets mixed with the gas. And I'll show how that's done and talk about ratios around that as well. Ratios of gas to oil. So mixed gasoline, mixed with oil, goes into the 2-stroke. So there are other options in terms of mixing gasoline. So I'll just go ahead and show it. So typically you have a gas, and then you have a small little tub of oil that goes into your 2-stroke container. There's a ratio on the back that'll say 50-1. This says this does 2.5 gallons. You just pour that in and then you're all set. The ratio is correct. Now, if you don't want to deal with mixing or messing with fuel and it being messy, you can go buy these. This is True Fuel. It's at any hardware store. It's at car places like AutoZone. So this is 50-1, which is a very common ratio. I run 50-1 in all of these things and in these 3 pieces of equipment here. And this is for 2-cycle engines ready to go with 92 octane. So you can just buy this and pour it right into your 2-stroke engine. You don't need to deal with mixing. So these are great just for cleanliness and if you don't want to have to go buy the oil and the gasoline and mix it yourself. And a big piece, I'll just go ahead and mention, this is ethanol free. So I will say that whenever I'm going to get gasoline to mix for this equipment or to pour into a 4-stroke, which I'm not mixing, I try to always get ethanol free. The ethanol in the 10% ethanol gas will start to break down some components within. So we try to go for ethanol free. You can find those at different gas stations. You can look online. It'll say ethanol free, and 89 octane or whatever they have is perfectly fine for that. And Richard knows a lot more about fuels.
I was just going to butt in. I told Chris I'd do this. I have done a lot of work with ethanol, making ethanol, using ethanol in engines, whatever. Everything Chris says is absolutely true. One other, even more important thing is that ethanol is hygroscopic. It will draw, the minute it is created, it will draw moisture from the atmosphere, whether there's a cap on your fuel tank or whether everything's sealed up, it's still going to suck it in, and eventually you'll get more water in there than there normally would be if it was straight gasoline. What that does is create a brown, gooey, sludgy mass of floating gloop that just floats in the tank there over time. It could be as quickly as 5 or 6 weeks. It could take longer than that. Depends on the humidity. Like in a coastal region, it'll happen a lot quicker than it will in a drier region like Arizona. What this brown stuff does is it'll coagulate, but it doesn't stay that way. It'll separate. It will almost certainly get into an orifice in the carburetor or into the filter intake or something and cause a stoppage. It's probably the #1 cause of people discarding their perfectly good machines because they don't want to pay to have the carburetor replaced, because that's what most repair places are going to do. They're not going to take the time to dismantle it, blow it out, solvent clean it, and put it back together. They're just going to say it needs a new carburetor. So you'll get charged between $45 and maybe $100 on the small stuff, and the person's labor is, what he or she charges. So, it's expensive. I've had lawnmowers, chainsaws, pressure washers, pumps with a little bit of solvent, like carburetor cleaner, and a needle and an air compressor, or at least some way to compress air to blow it through. The problem is solved in about 15 minutes. Of course, I'm used to it, so it takes me 15 minutes. But take the carburetor apart, clean it out, put it back together, put it back on. Invariably, it's perfectly okay until the next time I forget to take the gas out in the winter. If you put the stabilizer in, and I'm sure Chris is going to talk about this, but the Stabil or any of the other name brand stuff, this will extend the life of that gasoline and also break the particles of potential gloop into such small pieces that it's not going to make a difference. And I will say before, the Stabil brand, this is fine. It's I think about $7.95 or $8 for that thing. That'll treat about 30 gallons, you think? 20-ish, 25 gallons. If you get the Marine version, which is the same company and everything, it's just blue, it says Marine, it'll treat 50 gallons for the same price, and I believe it's also a little stronger, a little more kick to it, because the marine environment is much rougher on engine, especially a 2-cycle engine, than the regular mower would see. So the ethanol, it's always aggravated me a little bit. The automotive industry has taken the steps necessary since the mid-'70s to adapt their equipment to ethanol in the fuel. We don't really have that much trouble with cars and trucks and ethanol in the fuel. All that trouble goes to outboard motors, chainsaws, weed eaters, lawnmowers, all that stuff, because the manufacturers have not taken the research and funding necessary to put into the carburetors that can handle it, and they also don't think they make it clear enough that you need to be either stabilizing that fuel or running it out, and if you're going to store it for any length of time, the piece of equipment, you need to drain the tank out. Now, in their defense, I will say that a car, one of the reasons we don't have trouble with a car is because you put gas in the tank fresh gas, new gas, in the tank every 3 days or every week or whatever. With these things, you'll use it one weekend and then maybe you won't see another use of it for 4 more weeks. So it sits in the tank, and then it's just more potential for problems. But that's basically the ethanol story. I mean, ethanol in itself is not a bad thing. It's just that the equipment has to be made and processed correctly to handle it, because it is more corrosive than gasoline. And number 2, people have to be educated on it. Other than the fact that it's made 96% of it's made from corn, which isn't a great thing, but ethanol can be made from almost any sugar and starch depending on the conversion. So it's actually a good homegrown renewable fuel, but we just don't know that. That's one of the problems. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
That's great. Question, Patrick.
I know that there are synthetic versions of the oil that you can use to mix in. Do you think that they are worth the money?
I don't jump for the synthetic. I do jump for something like the BioPlus for like chainsaw lube. It's vegetable oil based. I do pay a bit more for that, but I've never paid for more money for the synthetic 2-cycle to mix in. In my experience, the 2-cycle engines, they run the same no matter what. So it may be life or longevity of the engine itself could be affected, but that would take a longer study, I guess, and I don't use them frequently enough to necessitate going for that more money.
There is actually a jojoba-based bio 2-cycle oil as well.
I've read about it.
I haven't had experience with it, but it's actually made from the bean or a castor bean. I mean, there's different, but they're all a vegetarian-based oil product. So.
Yeah. How long is too long to store gas in?
I would say once you've hit 2 months, I'd be wary of it. But that also depends on your humidity and the container you're putting it in. So like a plastic container is not going to be as always as good as a metal container, but a metal container can sweat, which also makes a problem. So it just depends.
So some people will suggest keeping the tank full so that there's less room for condensation through temperature fluctuations for moisture to develop in the fuel. So maybe keeping it full if you are not going to drain it out. But yeah, past 2 months, I'd say maybe 3, possibly. I drain everything and run the stable through it and run it out, because it's just not worth the amount of energy and the time it takes to drain one of these or whatever equipment is, drain it and run it dry. It's far faster and easier than having to go in there later and pull the carburetor out and fix it. So it's important what Richard just said in that, again, that's going to save you so much time in terms of maintenance through that management technique of saying, I'm not going to let this ethanol, especially something with ethanol in it, sit, because it's going to gum up and it's going to end up clogging all those small holes in the carburetor. So if you did take that piece of equipment to a small engine repair person, like those numbers that Richard was just saying, you got $100 in labor, maybe you got 100 in parts, you're at $200 and you go, I paid 100 and I paid 100 and something for the piece of equipment. I'm obviously not going to do that. So that's why it's even the maintenance and management is even more important. So you don't run up against that as well. Question?
When you're putting in oil and you want to switch from regular to synthetic, you're not supposed to do that, and regular motors I've heard it'll damage.
No, so in like cars, when they say don't switch to synthetic, what they're really saying is that synthetic is thinner, and so if you were using old school conventional oil, it's thicker, right? It's thicker typically than synthetic, and so the idea is that if there were any seals that would have not let your old conventional oil through, that synthetic oil is thinner and it'll probably get around those seals, and then you might have a leak all of a sudden. So in no way is it a problem to go, in my experience, to go to synthetic if you've been using old, conventional oil. It's just a matter of, are you going to have a leak somewhere because there was already a seal that was failing? So if you had a brand new car and you had regular oil, unconventional oil, and then you went to synthetic, it's brand new, all the seals are good, you won't have a problem. And usually that's like the rear main seal or something that's going to cost, pull the transmission, drop everything out just to put in this new seal. So it's going to be a whole lot of money. So that's why that conversation's there, because it's not worth all that trouble. But there is a great product, I'll just say it. The only thing that I've ever seen work from a pour-in additive, and I don't have one here, you can't buy it at the store, it's called AT205. And I've seen it seal up rubber before. It's a rehydrating compound, so it just rehydrates seals. And it can rehydrate a rear main just a little bit. It can't fix big leaks. If your car needs repair, it probably needs it. But small, finer leaks, I've actually seen it rehydrate in my vehicles. And that can be used in engines, trannies, I think, and even power steering systems, I believe. But you have to order it online. So that's worked. But that's the synthetic conversation. Synthetic usually, it has a higher, it can handle a higher viscosity. It's a little better for the engine. It can stay in there longer. So there's a lot of pluses to synthetic. But you have another question back there?
Earlier when we were talking of draining the fuel and running the fuel out, that's the one thing you take away from this class. That solves the majority of your problems, to get the fuel out and let it run dry. So if you do that, that's going to save the majority of the problems that I've seen fixing. So I've been here at the repair cafe. I say everything that I've fixed here had that problem. But gummed up carburetor and you're cleaning it up.
And that's what, yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, and that's what I was saying earlier. If typically your problem point is going to be the carburetor getting the fuel and air into your engine. So very rarely do we see like an air filter clog so much that no air is getting through. It's pretty rare, but it's obviously something you want to check out first to make sure it isn't that.